Stop the world! We have consistently failed to prioritise security by design at the heart of a myriad of technologies, whether it's telecommunications hardware, whether it's software, now whether it's clean energy technologies that we're using.
Welcome to Stop the World, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute's podcast on security and international affairs. I'm Olivia Nelson.
And I'm David Rowe.
And today's an exciting day on the pod because, drum roll.
Because we're back to regular weekly programming?
No, sorry Dave. We're actually launching our next short series, or perhaps I should say relaunching, and that's the Sydney Dialogue Summit Sessions. ASPI's major cyber and critical technologies conference, the Sydney Dialogue, is taking place this September. And we'll be bringing you a short series of interviews focused on some of the tech, geopolitics and security issues that will be covered at TSD this year.
We'll bring you interviews with leading experts from around the world, some of whom will be joining us in Sydney. And they'll be talking about a wide range of topics, including my favourite subject, artificial intelligence, as well as hybrid threats, subsea cables, cybersecurity, clean tech, biotech and defence.
To kick off the series, we've got a short primer conversation between the Sydney Dialogue Director, Alex Caples, and Australia's Cyber and Critical Technology Ambassador, Brendan Dowling.
This conversation covers a lot of ground in a short time, including the cybersecurity threats our region is facing, the importance of security by design, and the links between the digital transition and green tech.
The digital transition is an opportunity to achieve the clean energy transition at the same time. But those two things don't naturally go hand in hand. This won't happen by itself.
And of course, we can't launch the series without a bit of a plug for the Sydney Dialogue itself.
The Sydney Dialogue is a huge stage for Australia, and we really appreciate working with ASPI on this. There's going to be great regional representation from the Pacific, from Asia, globally as well. I think it will be the place to have the discussion about security by design, about regional stability and security, about the clean energy transition when it comes to technology.
Welcome everybody to ASPI's podcast, Stop the World. My name's Alex Caples. I'm the Director of the Sydney Dialogue here at ASPI, and I'm joined by Brendan Dowling, Australia's Cyber Ambassador. Welcome, Brendan.
Great, thanks to be here, Alex.
Brendan, you and I were recently together in Taiwan at the Global Cooperation and Training Framework meeting, which was actually a really interesting meeting, a lot to do with resilience in telecommunications and cybersecurity in the region. Fascinating conference, but I think the phrase that we heard a lot there was cybersecurity is national security is regional security. And I think that rings true, perhaps more so now than ever before. But you've been doing quite a bit of travel in the region. Part of your role is to reach out and build those bridges, but also to understand where there are commonalities. I just wondered if you've got a bit of time to reflect on things that you've learned, initiatives you've seen that you think are useful, worthwhile. We'd love to hear them.
Yeah. Look, I think that phrase really captures it, that cybersecurity is integral to national security. And when we look at the challenging geopolitics in the region, that technology and cybersecurity piece is a core feature of what the future of this region looks like. We now see that countries are all dependent on digital infrastructure, whether it's our civilian critical infrastructure, whether it's our government services, whether it's economic activity, is all tied into digital technologies. Those digital technologies are inherently vulnerable to attacks, be it supply chain attacks through technology, be it cyber attacks. And unfortunately, we're seeing that play out in a very real, current, immediate way in the region. Taiwan, I think it's at the forefront of their minds, and we're looking to build up our collaboration because a stable region has a stable Taiwan at its core, and we are very invested in that. I think Taiwan, like Australia, recognises that cyber tools are being used as a tool of statecraft. I think we've seen states willing to use cyber as a tool of coercion, as a tool of interference. We've called that out in recent times. We've called out Chinese-backed actors. We've called out Russian-backed actors for interfering in democratic institutions, for potentially creating the capability to disrupt critical infrastructure. That's a conversation I'm trying to have throughout the region. I think it's beginning to be at the forefront of a lot of countries' minds. In Australia, we've really invested in our capability. We've really invested in our whole of nation approach to better cybersecurity. that's an example that a lot of countries in the region look to. So part of what I'm doing is talking about what we've learned, what we've got right, what we want to improve on, but also trying to build up that connectivity between countries in the region to lift our cyber resilience together.
Yeah, it makes sense, particularly as you say. Subsea cables is a classic example of this, of course, but infrastructure is so much connected that we really are dependent on one another to some extent. So interesting that you talk about where we can lead and where we might be able to learn a little bit. Are there areas that you think particularly Australia could be picking up on? I think we're going to come to some of the good work that DFAT but other agencies have done, particularly the cybersecurity strategy and implementation of that. But areas where you think, do you know what, I've really seen in the region a really great example of this, or this is an interesting and new way to think about this problem and we should be thinking about adopting it into our own thinking and planning?
I think there's a virtuous cycle in the way that a lot of countries are approaching this and the way we learn from each other. So, for example, the work we're doing on IoT security at the moment, smart device security, which I think is one of the least sort of focused on areas. We've made it a feature of the strategy we launched last year, but we are putting smart devices in every facet of our lives, from government, business, infrastructure, households. And the level of security of these devices is by and large bad. So they're very vulnerable. Singapore really led the world in trying to adopt better IoT security standards. We have learned a lot from that and we'll be adopting those type of standards in Australia. The positive thing there is we know we live in a global market, so the more we can align with other countries, the better. But that's a really clear example of where we've learned from a country in the region. I think when I go out to the Pacific, a really interesting lesson for me is that we often think about technology security, economic security, cyber security, and online safety as different issue sets. So certainly connected. But I'm finding when I talk to our friends and partners in the Pacific, they actually see a lot of these issues together. And I think there's a lot of merit to that. When you talk about online safety in the way that youth or older people engage with social media platforms, they're also vulnerable to scams and other fraudulent activity. They're also vulnerable when they're using things like smart devices which don't have security built in. And the way that Pacific Island nations often look at it is as a holistic picture. How do we ensure that our people are safe online, whether it's in the way they engage with online content or social media platforms, or whether it's in a cybersecurity sense? And I think there's something in that, creating more informed citizens who feel that they can engage in the online world in a safe and secure way, covers that full spectrum of issues. So I like the way that they think about it holistically.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's something that harks back to perhaps an older term, human security. We've seen various nations use that as perhaps a slightly different take on national security. It tends to bring in some of those social experiences and lived experiences as well. So that's a great thing to be bringing into our policies and our programs. I know DFAT, obviously through the cybersecurity strategy, is looking at the rapid response teams, looking to roll out assistance in various areas of the Pacific. That's very often after an event has occurred, and that's much more in that kind of how do we put a lid on a problem as quickly as possible, because often that's where you need the most expertise. But when we're thinking about it from that holistic point of view, where else in that spectrum is DFAT getting involved in the Pacific particularly, but also in the region?
Yeah, so the rapid response teams are really crucial, and it's unfortunate, but we are seeing a really increasing prevalence of cyber attacks in the Pacific. We're seeing ransomware gangs targeting Pacific Island nations, be it telecommunications networks, government services, banks. We're also seeing nation states very active throughout the region using their cyber tools as well. So we developed the rapid response teams as a way that we could provide assistance similar to what we do in a natural disaster, deploy a team of people, help with the recovery and the remediation on the ground. We are doing that more frequently than I think we would hope for. At the moment, we have multiple teams deployed out through the Pacific providing that type of assistance. But you're exactly right. That's only one part of the picture. That's post-incident, how do we help you recover? Oftentimes, the vulnerabilities that lead to the attack are because of insecure tech being deployed. And that's because Pacific Island nations are looking to digitalise at a really rapid clip, and there's huge benefits in terms of service delivery, in terms of e-commerce. So that's really positive. But we see that a lot of countries in the region are faced with this invidious choice between affordable technology and secure technology. So what we see when we go out and provide that assistance is there might be servers that haven't been updated in 15 years. There might be pirated software being used in a system. So it's great to be able to help and to recover from an incident, but unless we take a more practical, comprehensive approach to that uplift, they're just going to continue to be vulnerable. Our capacity building in the region over several years has done some really good work in terms of developing legal frameworks, in terms of developing training, awareness, but we're increasingly finding we need to get far more immediate and practical. What that looks like is actually buying new servers for a country that needs them, buying software licenses where we want to get access to better technology. We're currently doing a number of projects which are looking at migrating some government systems to the cloud in Pacific Islands. That will give, hopefully, better redundancy, better resilience, better security. So actually finding ways to not just say, you should be aware of these type of threats, but here's how we can help you be better prepared and better defended against them. So you'll increasingly see us working with Pacific Island countries to upgrade and uplift the technology that they use. We do really want private sector partners to come along with us on this. That means some of the big hyperscalers deploying in the Pacific at a price point that's available, sustainable, affordable for countries in the region. So that's a conversation we have with a lot of the big tech firms to say, this might not be a commercial proposition for you, but there is a development and a strategic objective here. We'd love to work with you in the region.
And ultimately, potentially longer term, a market. That's an investment
Yes,
rather than something that necessarily is an immediate return on investment. You're looking at that as a long term thing. Part of that is, I guess, it's in keeping with this philosophy and this growing philosophy that we're seeing around the world on security by design, essentially pushing security back up the chain to manufacturers, to service providers, to those who perhaps in a position to actually make sure that you're setting the appropriate standards for security from the get-go and that it's not immediately on, say, a consumer or the purchaser of a product. And in this case, I know we've been focusing on things like household products and Internet of Things, but equally you're looking at things like OT, you're looking at SCADA systems that run factories, you're looking at all of the automation piece that comes with a manufacturing sector as well. So there's a twin kind of conversation here, really. There's the digital transition that's happening and the cybersecurity element that comes with that. But equally, digital transition of necessity will both drive and needs to be supported by energy transition as well. And that circle can be a little bit difficult to square sometimes, particularly if we're looking at things like solar panels or big batteries. Those are an effort to move us in the right direction as far as climate adaptation. And yet we know that sometimes those things create additional security problems or secondary implications that we were not necessarily aware of in the first instance. It's about then, I think, making those conscious choices about, we know we need digital transition, we know we need energy transition, and we need that base power load that is really the often forgotten third arm in this trifecta of the flywheel of future economies and societies, which will be AI and a range of other critical technologies like quantum, but also data and real-time data and lots of it, and then energy and predictable base power loads. How we do that in a climate-conscious, renewable way and how we support things like AI, which need a whole lot of data, is an ongoing kind of question in our region but also elsewhere. If you've got, I suppose, any initial thoughts on how other countries are looking at that, how Australia is looking at that. I know that we'll be looking at that as part of the Sydney Dialogue in September, but would love to hear some thoughts. And obviously we'll be press ganging you into service for the TSD as well.
Yes, look, I can't wait for the TSD. It's going to be a tremendous event which will hit all of these issues, no doubt. I think essentially we're at a point where we can make a choice, and the digital transition is an opportunity to achieve the clean energy transition at the same time. But those two things don't naturally go hand in hand. This won't happen by itself. I think we sort of imagine the digital world to be a sort of greener world, but it's not necessarily the case. When we look at the consumption of energy that goes into AI processing, that goes into Bitcoin, that goes into data centers, we are creating an incredible amount of data, and the exponential curve on which data storage and data processing will go is mind-boggling. But the energy consumption, I think, is really underappreciated. So unless we make the right choices along that digital transition, we potentially miss the benefits of the clean energy transition as well. So I think it's incumbent on governments and major technology players to actually think about these two things together. I don't think we're doing that at the moment. I think big hyperscale technology companies talk a big game, but actually the energy consumption, the water consumption that goes with some of the tech that they're building, I think is potentially problematic. So the investment in more efficient data storage, data processing, I think is key, unlocks everything else. I think your point around new green technologies and security is a really important one. We have consistently failed to prioritize security by design at the heart of a myriad of technologies, whether it's telecommunications hardware, whether it's software, now whether it's clean energy technologies that we're using. It's a relatively simple idea to put security at the heart of your design and development process. I think we can have secure supply chains for green technology if we make the choices to do it. And there's a role for government to help guide industry on this pathway, but we haven't done it very well historically. We've rushed to market. We've seen new products developed. That's been what has been prioritized by the technology industry. And time again, we've seen the security vulnerabilities not addressed at the outset. And you make the really important point that we've left it to end users to deal with it. Cybersecurity is hard. Technology security is hard when you leave it to the end user. When you've got to add different products, when you've got to configure things, it makes it difficult and people are less inclined to do it. The more that we consider this in the design and development phase rather than the deployment phase, rather than hoping that everyone will become more security conscious or more cyber aware, I think that's a losing strategy. We actually need to expect it in the products and technology that we use. That means a real consciousness of supply chains, whether it's in software, whether it's in solar panels, thinking about what the risks are, identifying them, managing them. It's all possible, but we are at a point where we are faced with a choice, and unless we make an active choice to prioritize security as part of the digital transition and greener energy, greener technology as part of the digital transition, we risk repeating the same mistakes we have in the past.
Couldn't agree more. History is, if past is prologue, unless you change your behaviour, you're really not going to see a change in the outcome. It's a really interesting, a series of interesting points there, Brendan, around this, and pointing, I suppose, to the idea really of how we create an environment in which security interests and economic interests, whilst not always the same, can at least run parallel, and that there's a mutual appreciation of why they need to run in parallel.
Yep.
But equally, I think for those who are at the developers, the big multinationals who, as you say, might be talking a big game, to genuinely invest in this and to recognise that this, in future, I think will become perhaps a market differentiator for them. People will be looking for this as a service. It will be an expectation that's generated. And I think we're seeing that. We're just on the cusp, perhaps, of some of those expectations now, articulated by governments, but I think intuitively felt by populations, perhaps for a lot longer than that. Look, a really interesting conversation, a very brief one, I'm afraid, because I know that you're a busy man. Really just to say we look forward to embarking on some more of these conversations and expanding on this dialogue on all of these sorts of tricky concepts, the nexus of where geopolitics meets technology, meets cybersecurity, at the Sydney Dialogue, 2nd and 3rd of September at the International Convention Centre in Sydney. Tickets are available now, so please do register. We'd love to see you there. And
Can I join that plug? I think
you absolutely can.
As a premier regional technology and cybersecurity forum, I think the Sydney Dialogue is a huge stage for Australia, and we really appreciate working with ASPI on this. There's going to be great regional representation from the Pacific, from Asia, globally as well. I think it will be the place to have the discussion about security by design, about regional stability and security, about the clean energy transition when it comes to technology. I'm really excited about it.
Well, so am I, but I will also be using you for all my plugs in future, Brendan. You do them so much better than I do. But we're really looking forward to seeing you there and hopefully to some of our listeners as well.
Great, thank you.
If you're interested in finding out more about the Sydney Dialogue, we've included a link to the TSD website in your episode notes.
And that's all we have time for today, folks. Thanks for listening.